How a forgotten technique changed everything. It began as a footnote, a method mentioned briefly in old notebooks, dismissed by modern kitchens as inefficient and obsolete. No one expected it to return, let alone reshape the future of cooking. But sometimes, the smallest forgotten detail carries the power to undo an entire system. The culinary world had grown confident in its progress. Precision replaced intuition. Technology promised consistency. Techniques were streamlined, optimized, and standardized until creativity felt safe but narrow. Chefs mastered tools faster than they mastered time. And quietly, without anyone noticing, something ancient slipped out of practice. The technique was slow, inconvenient, impossible to scale. It required patience most kitchens could no longer afford, and attention no algorithm could replicate. It asked cooks to listen instead of control, to wait instead of force. That was why it vanished, not because it failed, but because it demanded too much. To understand how it returned, we have to go back to a young cook standing at the edge of exhaustion. He worked in one of the most advanced kitchens in the world, surrounded by innovation and efficiency. Everything ran perfectly, and yet, night after night, the food felt empty, flawless, but forgettable. He couldn't explain what was missing, only that something essential had been removed. One evening, cleaning out a storage room scheduled for renovation, he found a box of handwritten notes left behind by a retired chef. Inside were diagrams, timings measured in instinct rather than minutes, and references to a technique no longer taught. Most cooks would have thrown them away. He didn't. He tried it in secret, late at night after service ended. The process was slow and uncertain. The results were inconsistent, but the flavor, when it worked, was undeniable. It carried depth he hadn't tasted since childhood, something alive and unpredictable. He didn't realize it yet, but by touching that forgotten technique, he had reopened a door the industry had deliberately closed. And once that door was open, nothing would return to the way it was before. At first, the cook treated the technique like a secret indulgence. He practiced it alone, long after the kitchen emptied, listening to the buildings settle around him. There were no guarantees. Some nights the result failed completely. Other nights, it produced a depth that startled him into silence. The inconsistency frustrated him, but also awakened something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity without expectation. He began serving small tests to colleagues he trusted. No explanations, no context, just a spoonful at the end of service. The reactions were immediate and strangely emotional. Some frowned, confused. Others closed their eyes instinctively. One veteran cook whispered that it tasted like a dish their grandmother used to make, though they couldn't say why. The technique didn't announce itself. It lingered, but secrecy has limits. As the cook grew bolder, he tried incorporating the method into a staff meal. The head chef noticed instantly the flavor didn't match the kitchen's usual precision. It wasn't wrong, but it didn't conform. Questions followed. Where did this come from? Why was it inconsistent? Why did it take so long? The cook answered honestly. The response was polite, then firm. This kitchen did not have time for nostalgia. The method clashed with everything the operation stood for. It disrupted timing. It resisted measurement. It couldn't be replicated reliably across stations. And in a kitchen built on excellence through control, anything uncontrollable was treated as a liability. The cook was warned not to use it again. He obeyed publicly. Privately, he continued. He studied the old notes more carefully, realizing they were not instructions but observations. The technique wasn't about steps. It was about attention. It required the cook to sense subtle changes most kitchens no longer allowed time to notice. Heat wasn't adjusted by number, but by sound. Completion wasn't marked by timer, but by aroma. It demanded presence, not efficiency. Slowly, the cook understood why it had disappeared. It didn't fit modern systems. It couldn't be taught quickly. And it made outcomes depend on the cook rather than the process. In an industry chasing consistency, that dependence felt dangerous. Then the conflict escalated. A visiting chef, renowned, influential, tasted a dish the cook had quietly prepared using the technique. They paused, asked who made it, Ask how. When the explanation came, the reaction was not admiration but concern. This method, they warned, was romantic and irresponsible. It encouraged variance. It undermined standards. It belonged to a past the industry had worked hard to move beyond. Word began to spread, cautiously at first, a forgotten technique, an old way resurfacing. Some dismissed it immediately, others grew curious. And as whispers moved through kitchens and culinary schools, a line began to form between those who believed progress required forgetting and those who sensed that something essential had been left behind. The technique had returned, and the world was not prepared for what that meant. The reaction was swift and divided. Culinary forums debated the technique's legitimacy. Educators dismissed it as unreliable. Consultants warned that encouraging intuition over control invited chaos. Yet in quiet corners of the industry, cooks began to try it anyway, after hours, off menu, away from scrutiny. The technique spread the way forbidden knowledge always does, slowly, privately, and with conviction. Those who practiced it felt the same thing the young cook had felt, a return of responsibility. When a dish failed, there was no system of blame. When it succeeded, the satisfaction ran deeper than praise. Cooking stopped feeling like execution and started feeling like judgment again. The technique did not promise success. It demanded attention. But attention comes at a cost. In professional kitchens, time is currency. The technique required waiting, listening, adjusting, things schedules did not allow. Cooks who embraced it stayed later. Prep slowed. Service grew unpredictable. Management noticed. Some kitchens banned it outright. Others tolerated it briefly, until inconsistency appeared on the plate. The young cook felt the pressure tightening. He was no longer just experimenting. He was becoming a liability. Then came the confrontation. During a critical service, a dish prepared with a forgotten technique left the kitchen and reached a high-profile table. The timing slipped. The plate didn't match the expected profile. The head chef tasted it personally. The flavor was undeniable, but the deviation was visible. The service continued, but the message was delivered later, privately and firmly. This kitchen would not bend. The cook was given a choice: abandon the technique and commit fully to the system, or leave. There was no compromise, no hybrid approach. Progress, the chef insisted, required discipline, not sentiment. That night, the cook packed his knives. The decision felt reckless. He had no plan, no backing, no guarantee that the technique would work outside the controlled environment he was leaving behind. But he understood something clearly now. The technique was not meant to coexist with systems built on speed and certainty. It belonged to places willing to risk failure for depth. As he stepped away from the kitchen that had trained him, word followed. Some cooks admired his conviction. Others saw him as naive. The industry largely shrugged and moved on, one less cook chasing ghosts. But the technique did not disappear with him. It moved into smaller kitchens, remote restaurants, private tables, places where patience still had value. And as it settled into new hands, it began to change not just how food tasted, but how cooks understood their role. The conflict had reached its breaking point. What followed would determine whether the forgotten technique would fade again into obscurity or quietly reshape the future from the margins inward. The technique found its home in places the industry rarely watched. Small kitchens with no margins for spectacle. Restaurants where the cook still touched every plate. Homes where meals mattered more than timelines. There, the method stopped feeling rebellious and started feeling natural, because it was no longer fighting a system that feared it. The cook opened a modest restaurant far from culinary capitals. No press, no manifesto, just a menu that changed with attention rather than trend. The forgotten technique sat quietly at the center of it all, shaping dishes that felt alive, sometimes uneven, sometimes extraordinary, always honest. Guests noticed immediately, not because the food was perfect, but because it felt present. Word spread slowly, not through rankings or awards, but through cooks. They came after service. They watched, they tasted, they asked questions that had no short answers. The cook didn't teach the technique as a formula. He taught listening, waiting, accepting uncertainty. He taught that control was not the same as mastery. Years passed. What began as a discarded footnote started appearing again in unexpected places. Not labeled, not branded, but recognizable to those who had felt it. Flavors deepened. Kitchens slowed just enough to breathe. Cooks took responsibility for judgment instead of hiding behind systems. The industry didn't announce a shift, but it adjusted. Eventually, even the institutions took notice. Schools quietly reintroduced the ideas behind technique, reframing them as advanced intuition. Consultants softened their stance. Chefs who once dismissed it began referencing it indirectly, without naming its origin. The method had survived not by confrontation, but by persistence. The cook never claimed credit. He understood that techniques don't change the world on their own. People do, when they are willing to trade certainty for presence. The forgotten method had not replaced modern cooking. It had reminded it of something essential, that progress without attention is hollow. And in kitchens across the world, something subtle endured. Cooks paused more often. They listened longer. They trusted themselves again. The technique was no longer forgotten. It was simply no longer advertised. And that was why it lasted. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again?